The Bequest. A man died far from his home, and in the portion of his will which he had available for bequest, he left in these words: "Let the community where the land is situated take what they wish for themselves, and let them give that which they wish to Arif the humble." Now Arif was a young man at the time, who had far less apparent authority than anyone in the community. Therefore the elders took possession of whatever they wanted from the land which had been left, and they allocated to Arif a few trifles only, which nobody else wanted. Many years later Arif, grown to strength and wisdom, went to the community to claim his patrimony. "These are the objects which we have allocated to you in accordance with the will," said the elders. They did not feel that they had usurped anything, for they had been told to take what they wished. But in the middle of the discussion, an unknown man of grave countenance and compelling presence appeared among them. He said, "The meaning of the will was that you should give to Arif that which you wished for yourselves, for he can make the best use of it." In the moment of illumination which this statement gave them, the elders were able to see the true meaning of the phrase, "Let them give that which they wish to Arif." "Know," continued the apparition, "that the testator died unable to protect his property, which would, in case of his making Arif his legatee in an obvious sense, have been usurped by this community. At the very least it would have caused dissension. So he entrusted it to you, knowing that if you thought that it was your own property you would take care of it. Hence he made a wise provision for the preservation and transmission of this treasure. The time has now come for it to be returned to its rightful use." Thus it was that the property was handed back. The elders were able to see the truth. The Sufi teaching that people wish for themselves what they should wish for others is stressed in this story by Sayyid Ghaus Ali Shah, the Qadiri order's saint who died in 1881 and is buried at Panipat. This idea is not uncommon, though in folklore it is usually interpreted to show how a bequest came in the long run to a deserving legatee, who had for years been unable to claim his patrimony. In some Dervish circles this story is taught as an illustration of the claim, "You have many endowments which are yours on trust alone. When you understand this, you can give them to the rightful owners." The Oath. A man who was troubled in mind once swore that if his problems were solved, he would sell his house and give all the money gained from it to the poor. The time came when he realized that he must redeem his oath. But he did not want to give away so much money. So he thought of a way out. He put the house on sale at 1 silver piece. Included with the house, however, was a cat. The price asked for this animal was 10,000 pieces of silver. Another man bought the house and cat. The first man gave the single piece of silver to the poor, and pocketed the 10,000 for himself. Many people's minds work like this. They resolve to follow a teaching, but they interpret their relationship with it to their own advantage. Until they overcome this tendency by special training, they cannot learn at all. The trick described in this story, according to its dervish teller, Sheikh Nazir el-Din Shah, may be deliberate, or it may describe the warped mind which unconsciously performs tricks of this kind. The Sheikh, also known as the Lamp of Delhi, died in 1846. His shrine is in Delhi, India. This version, attributed to him, is from an oral tradition of the Chishti order. It is used to introduce the psychological technique designed to stabilize the mind, making it incapable of tricks of self-deception. The Idiot in the Great City. There are different kinds of awakening. Only one is the right way. Man is asleep, but he must wake in the right way. There is a story of an ignoramus whose awakening was not correct. This idiot came to a huge city, and he was confused by the number of people in the streets. Fearing that if he slept and woke again, he would not be able to find himself among so many people, he tied a gourd to his ankle for identification. A practical joker, knowing what he had done, waited until he was asleep, then removed the gourd and tied it around his own leg. He, too, lay down on the caravanserai floor to sleep. The fool woke first and saw the gourd. At first he thought this other man must be him. Then he attacked the other, shouting, "If you are me, then who, for heaven's sake, who and where am I?" This tale, which also appears in the Mullah Nasruddin corpus of jokes which is known throughout Central Asia, is preserved in the great spiritual classic Salaman and Absal by the 15th century author and mystic Abdur Rahman Jami. He came from across the Oxus and died in Herat after establishing himself as one of the greatest literary figures in the Persian language. Jami caused a great deal of resentment among divines because of his forthrightness, especially by saying that he recognized no teacher except his own father. The founding of a tradition. Once upon a time there was a town composed of two parallel streets. A dervish passed through one street into the other, and as he reached the second one, the people there noticed that his eyes were streaming with tears. "Someone has died in the other street," one cried, and soon all the children in the neighborhood had taken up the cry. What had really happened was that the dervish had been peeling onions. Within a short space of time the cry had reached the first street, and the adults of both streets were so distressed and fearful, for each community was related to the other, that they dared not make complete inquiries as to the cause of the furore. A wise man tried to reason with the people of both streets, asking why they did not question each other. Too confused to know what they meant, some said, "For all we know, there is a deadly plague in the other street." This rumour too spread like wildfire, until each street's populace thought that the other was doomed. When some measure of order was restored, it was only enough for the two communities to decide to emigrate to save themselves. Thus it was that, from different sides of the town, both streets entirely evacuated their people. Now, centuries later, the town is still deserted, and not so far away are two villages. Each village has its own tradition of how it began as a settlement from a doomed town, through a fortunate flight, in remote times, from a nameless evil. In their psychological teaching, Sufis claim that ordinary transmission of knowledge is subject to so much deformation through editing and false memory that it cannot be taken as a substitute for direct perception of fact. Illustrating subjectivity of the human brain, the founding of a tradition is quoted from the teaching book Asra-il-Kawatiya, Secrets of the Recluses, by Sheikh Kalandar Shah of the Surawadi order, who died in 1832. His shrine is at Lahore, in Pakistan. Fatima the Spinner and the Tent. Once in a city in the farthest west, there lived a girl called Fatima. She was the daughter of a prosperous spinner. One day her father said to her, "Come, daughter, we are going on a journey, for I have business in the islands of the Middle Sea. Perhaps you may find some handsome youth in a good situation whom you could take as a husband." They set off and travelled from island to island, the father doing his trading, while Fatima dreamt of the husband who might soon be hers. One day, however, they were on the way to Crete when a storm blew up, and the ship was wrecked. Fatima, only half conscious, was cast up on the seashore near Alexandria. Her father was dead, and she was utterly destitute. She could only remember dimly her life until then, for her experience of the shipwreck and her exposure in the sea had utterly exhausted her. While she was wandering on the sands, a family of clothmakers found her. Although they were poor, they took her into their humble home and taught her their craft. Thus it was that she made a second life for herself, and within a year or two she was happy and reconciled to her lot. But one day, when she was on the seashore for some reason, a band of slave traders landed and carried her, along with other captives, away with them. Although she bitterly lamented her lot, Fatima found no sympathy from the slavers, who took her to Istanbul and sold her as a slave. Her world had collapsed for the second time. Now it chanced that there were few buyers at the market. One of them was a man who was looking for slaves to work in his woodyard, where he made masts for ships. When he saw the dejection of the unfortunate Fatima, he decided to buy her, thinking that in this way, at least, he might be able to give her a slightly better life than if she were bought by someone else. He took Fatima to his home, intending to make her a serving maid for his wife. When he arrived at the house, however, he found that he had lost all his money in a cargo which had been captured by pirates. He could not afford workers, so he, Fatima, and his wife were left alone to work at the heavy labour of making masts. Fatima, grateful to her employer for rescuing her, worked so hard and so well that he gave her her freedom, and she became his trusted helper. Thus it was that she became comparatively happy in her third career. One day he said to her, "Fatima, I want you to go with a cargo of ship's masts to Java as my agent, and be sure that you sell them at a profit." She set off, but when the ship was off the coast of China, a typhoon wrecked it, and Fatima found herself again cast up on a seashore of a strange land. Once again she wept bitterly, for she felt that nothing in her life was working in accordance with expectation. Whenever things seemed to be going well, something came and destroyed all her hopes. "Why is it," she cried out for the third time, "that whenever I try to do something it comes to grief? Why should so many unfortunate things happen to me?" But there was no answer. So she picked herself up from the sand and started to walk inland. Now it so happened that nobody in China had heard of Fatima or knew anything about her troubles. But there was a legend that a certain stranger, a woman, would one day arrive there, and that she would be able to make a tent for the emperor. And since there was as yet nobody in China who could make tents, everyone looked upon the fulfillment of this prediction with the liveliest anticipation. In order to make sure that this stranger, when she arrived, would not be missed, successive emperors of China had followed the custom of sending heralds, once a year, to all the towns and villages of the land, asking for any foreign woman to be produced at court. When Fatima stumbled into a town by the Chinese seashore, it was one such occasion. The people spoke to her through an interpreter and explained that she would have to go to see the emperor. "Lady," said the emperor when Fatima was brought before him, "can you make a tent?" "I think so," said Fatima. She asked for rope, but there was none to be had. So, remembering her time as a spinner, she collected flax and made ropes. Then she asked for stout cloth, but the Chinese had none of the kind which she needed. So, drawing on her experience with the weavers of Alexandria, she made some stout tent cloth. Then she found that she needed tent poles, but there were none in China. So Fatima, remembering how she had been trained by the wood fashioner of Istanbul, cunningly made stout tent poles. When these were ready, she racked her brains for the memory of all the tents she had seen in her travels, and lo, a tent was made. When this wonder was revealed to the Emperor of China, he offered Fatima the fulfillment of any wish she cared to name. She chose to settle in China, where she married a handsome prince, and where she remained in happiness, surrounded by her children, until the end of her days. It was through these adventures that Fatima realized that what had appeared to be an unpleasant experience at the time turned out to be an essential part of the making of her ultimate happiness. This story is well known in Greek folklore, many of whose contemporary motifs feature dervishes and their legends. The version cited here is attributed to the Sheikh Muhammad Jamaluddin of Adrianople. He founded the Jamaliya order, the Beautiful, and died in 1750. The Gates of Paradise. There was once a good man. He had spent his whole life in cultivating the qualities enjoined upon those who would reach paradise. He gave freely to the poor, he loved his fellow creatures, and he served them. Remembering the need to have patience, he endured great and unexpected hardships, often for the sake of others. He made journeys in search of knowledge. His humility and exemplary behavior was such that his repute as a wise man and good citizen resounded from the east to the west, and from the north to the south. All these qualities he did indeed exercise, whenever he remembered to do so. But he had one shortcoming, and that was heedlessness. This tendency was not strong in him, and he considered that, balanced against the other things which he did practice, it could only be regarded as a small fault. There were some poor people whom he did not help, because from time to time he was insensitive to their needs. Love and service, too, were sometimes forgotten when what he thought to be personal needs, or at least desires, welled up in him. He was fond of sleep, and sometimes when he was asleep, opportunities to seek knowledge, or to understand it, or to practice real humility, or to add to the sum of total good behavior, such opportunities passed by, and they did not return. Just as the good qualities left their impress upon his essential self, so did the characteristic of heedlessness. And then he died. Finding himself beyond this life, and making his way towards the doors of the walled garden, the man paused to examine his conscience. And he felt that his opportunity of entering the high portals was enough. The gates, he saw, were shut, and then a voice addressed him, saying, "Be watchful, for the gates will open only once in every 100 years." He settled down to wait, excited at the prospect. But deprived of chances to exercise virtues towards mankind, he found that his capacity of attention was not enough for him. After watching for what seemed like an age, his head nodded in sleep. For an instant his eyelids closed, and in that infinitesimal moment the gates yawned open. Before his eyes were fully open again, they closed, with a roar loud enough to wake the dead. This is a favourite dervish teaching, sometimes called the parable of heedlessness. Although well known as a folk tale, its origins are lost. Some have attributed to Hadrat Ali, the fourth caliph. Others say that it was so important as to be passed down secretly from the Prophet himself. It certainly is not to be found in any of the attested traditions of the Prophet. The literary form in which it is given here derives from the works of an unknown dervish of the 17th century, Amil Baba, whose manuscripts stress that the real author is he whose work is anonymous, for in that way nobody stands between the learner and that which is learnt.